Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the HUD CARES Act Virtual Training Conference for 2022. This session will address eligible CDBG and CDBG-CV public service activities. Next slide. Okay. Just some quick housekeeping items. The PowerPoint presentations and the webinar recording will be available on HUD Exchange following the session. Participants will be in listen-only mode for today's session. Closed captions can be viewed using the Show Captions feature below the video player, the little green button there. You can consult the attendee guide for more information, which is available on the resources page of the event website. You may also submit content-related questions using the Q&A feature located below the video player. You may need to scroll down on the web page to view the Q&A right below the live stream. You're also encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation. You don't need to wait until the end of the presentation to submit questions. You can always just click the Q&A button and fire away. Also, we have chat functionality. For any technical issues, you can request assistance through the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. That's always there next to the live stream. Additionally, if you have any questions related to technical issues, connectivity, etc., you can always contact event support at sitemgroup.com as shown on the screen, and a representative will be happy to assist you. Also, we're going to have a couple of polls during today's session, so you can answer the poll questions by clicking on polls in the Slido window below the live stream. You may need to scroll down on the page to do that. With questions and polls, if you'd like to access questions and polls while simultaneously viewing the event without scrolling down, you can download the Slido app on your phone or go to sli.do in your web browser. Then type in the code for this session. The code will be posted to the chat here momentarily by our support team. You can also scroll to the bottom of the page to find the Slido code in the session description. All right. With those housekeeping details addressed, my name is Clint Whited. I'm a Senior Vice President with MDG Associates, LLC. With me today is Randall Mullen, Vice President with TDA Consulting. Our companies are part of the HUD Technical Assistance Team, helping states, counties, and cities administer and implement the CDBG and CDBG-CV funds to address the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. For this segment of today's conference, we'll be discussing eligible CDBG and CDBG public service activities. Next slide. When Congress passed the Housing and Community Development Act in 1974, several categorical programs with their own separate rules and requirements were merged into a single community development block grant program. 47 or more years later, the CDBG program's flexibility continues to serve communities well because there's tremendous flexibility in the ways CDBG funds can be used to address local needs, while those individuals that administer and implement the CDBG funded activities have the advantage of operating a familiar program with a standard set of time-tested rules. Today, citizen participation and local decision-making continue to be the hallmark of the CDBG program, allowing communities to address the COVID-19 pandemic under a set of common rules, while also having the flexibility to determine which CDBG activities best serve their community. As you can see here, the public service category of eligible activities is very broad, including activities such as employment, job training, crime prevention or public safety, but not general policing, childcare and health-related services, or even substance abuse services. Within the CDBG public service eligible activities, the ability to provide health-related services has taken on greater importance as a result of the pandemic. Next slide. Public services also include services related to housing, such as housing counseling, fair housing counseling, energy conservation, and down payment assistance, which is differentiated from a separate eligible activity called direct home ownership assistance. Under public services, the assistance to the home buyer is limited to the down payment only, and that assistance counts toward the state or entitlement grantee's 15% public service cap, which Randall will discuss later. There's also a separate eligible activity, as I mentioned, called direct home ownership assistance that can provide deeper subsidy and more assistance that's outside of the public service cap. For those of you that attended the session on housing and other real property activities earlier today, you learned that the direct home ownership assistance activity can provide up to 50% of the down payment, plus reasonable closing costs, principal write down, primary financing, and even PMI. So the list goes on of public service activities, including services for homeless persons, services related to education, welfare services, services for seniors, and recreational services. You'll notice that the term welfare services is here on the slide. That's not referring to an income payments program like temporary assistance for needy families or TAMF. What the statute and regulations are referring to here with the term welfare services is public services that promote the well-being of your residents, including services or necessities, but excluding income payments, which Randall will touch on again later in this session. All right, at this time, I'm going to ask our representative from CITEM to go ahead and open our first Slido poll question. What public service activities does your community currently fund with CDBG funds? Just below the live stream window, you're invited to respond and indicate the types of activities you're funding. Many of the ones that you've seen on the slides here are in the poll question and on that list. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Talking a bit about public service costs. Similar to the wide variety of public service activities, the types of costs that can be paid with CDBG funds under a public service activity are also quite diverse. For public service activities, CDBG funds may be used to pay for labor, supplies, and materials. Funds may also be used for operations and maintenance of the facility where public services are delivered. So for example, if you're paying for the lease, the insurance, furnishings, or maintenance of a COVID-19 testing site, those are all maintenance and operations costs for a facility where public services are being provided and would be eligible as public service costs under your public service cap activity. So it's important to keep a couple of things in mind when you're considering the types and amount of costs you're willing to pay for a particular public service activity. First, is the cost directly related to the provision of the eligible public services? If you can't reasonably link the cost to that eligible public service activity, it's not an eligible cost. So to give you an example, if a subrecipient requests funds for maintenance of their facility, have they documented the nature and use of that facility? Is the facility exclusively used for the public service activity? Or is there a portion of that facility or building that's used for other things like administrative offices or a fundraising call center or something completely different? If the situation is the latter, where there are multiple uses of the facility, you need to dive in a little deeper and understand the amount of maintenance costs that's actually allocable to the CDBG public service activity. And you need to document that those costs are directly related to the provision of the CDBG public service. So again, that concept of tying the cost and tying the activity that's taking place in the facility to the eligible public service is key. Second, and perhaps most importantly in everything that we do in federal grants management, document, document, document. Although there are many things a grantee can pay for under a public service activity, most grantees are cautious about the types of costs paid with CDBG funds. In many situations, public service funds are limited. The grantee is not always paying for 100% of the cost of the activity. And some costs are easier for agencies implementing public service activities to document properly than others. For example, a $25,000 public service activity implemented by a subrecipient might include $10,000 of CDBG funds for labor and $15,000 of CDBG funds for supplies. What are you looking for with their reimbursement requests? Well, for the $10,000 of labor costs, you're looking for timesheets and payroll records for the personnel that are directly implementing your public service activity. Since funds are also used for supplies, we see that in our example, our budget's $15,000. You're also looking for procurement documentation, evidence of payment, and tying those transactions out to the general ledger. As you know, some agencies implementing public service activities are better at documenting certain costs. Take their capacity, their compliance track record, and the availability of other leveraged funds within the activity into consideration when you're writing your written agreements, because there may be alternatives that reduce the documentation burden for you and for your partners. If an agency is great at doing timesheets and payroll, but they're terrible at procurement and documenting non-personnel costs, consider using the whole $25,000 in our example activity for labor. Have that conversation with your implementation partners and make good decisions to set them up for success. Although the CDBG program provides great flexibility in terms of what you can do, it isn't always wise to try and do everything. Next slide. When making the decision to fund a public service activity, that public service must be a new service or a quantifiable increase in the level of an existing service. This requirement is applicable to CDBG and CDBG-CV assisted public service activities. A new service is a service that has not been provided by the grantee or another entity on the grantee's behalf with local government funding within the last 12 months preceding your action plan submission to HUD. So that's a new service. An existing service is a service that's been provided by the grantee or another entity on the grantee's behalf using local government funding within the 12 months preceding your action plan submission to HUD. So the concept I'm trying to convey here is that CDBG funds cannot supplant local or state funds that are already used for the same purpose, let's say your public service activity. So I'll give you an example. If a senior health screening program that was operating with local general funds within 12 months prior to your action plan submission, and that program served 100 people during the year, and then they subsequently decide to apply for CDBG funds for the upcoming year, the CDBG funds that you would potentially invest in that activity must be used to quantifiably increase the level of service provided by the senior health screening program. So the number of people served by that activity would need to increase over the 100 people that they normally serve with local government funds to reflect that additional CDBG investment. Effectively, CDBG funds would need to be used to quantifiably increase the level of service. You might expect that if you increase their budget for that senior program by 50% as a result of the CDBG investment, perhaps the accomplishment goal moves from 100 people to 150 people that would now be served. So that's kind of an example. What can't happen? What is the rule? You can't replace the local general funds within with CDBG funds and continue serving the same 100 people. No supplanting, effectively. And some of you have encountered this situation before or will encounter it in the future. Conversation that has been had many times. The assistant city manager comes into your office, indicates that the city budget is tight, cuts are necessary. The assistant city manager asks you about how CDBG funds can be used in the community. You provide an overview of eligible CDBG public service activities based on what you learned here at the 2022 CARES Act conference. The assistant city manager then asks about the senior health screening program that's available at the senior center. And if that's a possibility for CDBG funds, what's your response going to be? Of course, you're going to respond, no, you can't supplant the local general funds for the activity. And that if you were to invest CDBG funds in the activity, which is quite all right, you can add CDBG funds to the activity, but you can't take away the local general funds because it was an existing activity within 12 months of your action plan submission. If you did put CDBG funds in that situation, HUD would expect to see a quantifiable increase in the level of service, not just simply swapping out local funds for CDBG funds. There is one important distinction and caveat to understand with new service or quantifiable increase. If the service is already CDBG funded, and let's use a slightly different example. Let's say you funded a child care center with CDBG in fiscal year 2021, and you're considering funding that child care center again in fiscal year 2022. you do not need to require that that program increase its services. So the restriction doesn't mean that currently funded service organizations receiving CDBG funds need to do more year after year after year, potentially with less. It really applies to a new service or that isn't offered in your jurisdiction, or what I described as a quantifiable increase. So one of those key rules in public service activities. Next slide. It's also common for public service activities to be implemented by religious entities or faith-based organizations. Providing CDBG or CDBG-CV funds to a religious entity to implement an eligible public service activity is not unusual. In fact, we see it quite often. Childcare, education services, food pantries, centers that offer clothing and household supplies, homeless programs, of course. However, there's a separation, I think, when you're working with religious entities that must be observed. First, CDBG and CDBG-CV funds can't be used for religious activities or events. Very important. Program beneficiaries must not be required to pray or engage in any religious activity as a condition of receiving the CDBG funded service. Religious entities that are contracted to provide CDBG or CDBG-CV public services must agree in writing that employment decisions and eligibility to receive program services cannot be based on religion. There can be no discrimination on the basis of religion, and the CDBG public service activity cannot include any religious instruction or counseling. You can't preach, you can't promote your religion while providing the public services. You can't require the children that are participating at the daycare to pray before the meal. You need to maintain, and religious entities would need to maintain that separation, and you want to make sure if you are dealing with a service provider that is a religious entity that, you know, with the contract, before you get started on the project, before you proceed with the funding, that you go over this rule with them so that they understand that their role when using your funds and providing this particular program is as a service provider and not necessarily as a religious organization. They're a CDBG public service provider that just also happens to be a religious entity. Next slide. Often, public services offered by religious entities are implemented in facilities owned by the religious entity. You know, the food pantry that's in the back of the church, as an example. If the religious entity wants to use CDBG public service funds to make minor repairs to their facilities, so maintenance and operations, right? There's three considerations that you really need to evaluate. First, the repairs that they're proposing must be directly related to your public service activity. The repairs cannot be made where worship services are held. And third, the repair costs must only be an incidental portion of the total CDBG funding for the public service activity. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn to our team over at Slido and ask them to present on screen the results of poll question number 1. Let's take a look. So our participants today are mostly, it looks like we've got, what, 23 for senior services, 21 for homeless services, housing counseling, health services, childcare. So we've got a good variety here, employment and job training. And I think if I'd asked this question, and we have asked this question at basically CDBG trainings a few years ago when we were live and in person, I don't know that health services would have necessarily been this high. So it's interesting how the pandemic is impacting some of the responses. Health services, employment training, we see that the poll continues to move. I'm okay leaving it open for a couple minutes longer, but I think we're getting the gist of it here. A lot of services for seniors, probably some Meals on Wheels, home delivered meals, particularly during pandemic when they can't get out to shop. I'm seeing that in a number of jurisdictions. Obviously homelessness. Yeah, so a lot of participation in the poll. Thank you all for participating and logging the activities. You can select more than one as well. So, all right, good stuff here. All right, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and hand the presentation off to my colleague, Randall Mullen of TDA Consulting. Thank you very much, and I'll see you again at the end for our question and answer session. Looks like we're going to have plenty of time to answer your questions, and I look forward to reading through those. So thank you very much, and Randall, please take it away.
I will, and thank you, Clint. That was a very interesting presentation. In the next series of slides, we will look at eligible public service activities, particularly as they are funded under CDBG-CV. Where appropriate, I will distinguish between the annual formula eligibility guidance and the CV's grants alternative requirements, which provide more flexibility. You will also note that the activities are those which, quote, prevent, prepare, and respond to the coronavirus. I expect you've heard that phrase before. This is consistent with the requirement that uses of CV grants must tie back to the pandemic. I'll provide more details on that aspect of public services later. But under the category of public services, eligible uses of CV funds include, but are not limited to, items similar to what Clint already went over in the first part of this presentation, but with a slant toward a response to the pandemic. Job training to expand the pool of healthcare workers available to treat the disease within a community, or to provide testing, diagnose, and offer other services at different locations. Increase the capacity and availability of targeted health services for infectious disease response. Provide equipment, supplies, materials, and carry out public services such as food for food banks, which I'll be covering shortly. You remember Clint referenced a delivery of Meals on Wheels, but the programs during this pandemic may be focused on quarantined individuals or individuals that need to maintain social distancing due to medical vulnerabilities. A most different type of public service activity has been to pay for hotel room costs for vulnerable populations. Given the survey or poll results that the most common use of public services dollars, at least among the grantees represented in this presentation, relates to homeless services, I suppose we should not be surprised. And many of you may represent jurisdictions that have actually undertaken this very activity, paying hotel room costs for those who are homeless. Next slide, please. The most common use of CDBG-CV funds, that is, as an eligible public service, is clearly for emergency grant assistance. CDBG-CV funds may be used to provide emergency grant payments on behalf of individuals or families impacted for items as indicated here: food, housing, which can include emergency rental assistance or mortgage assistance, or utilities, for a period of up to 6 consecutive months. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that time period momentarily, but it represents an example of the alternative requirement that permits more flexibility in this regard than for the annual formula grant program. As this slide indicates, HUD waived and in effect extended the time period for providing such emergency payments. That is, grant assistance under this alternative requirement may be provided for a period of up to 6 months rather than 3 months. Next slide, please. It is important to note, however, that the emergency payments must be provided to a service provider, that is a third party. on behalf of the individuals and families who I'll refer to as the beneficiaries. The payments, they cannot go directly to those beneficiaries. As many of you know, grantees must not only ensure that activities eligible under CDBG regulations conform to those regulations, they must also conform to what I call the uniform administrative requirements. Those requirements are codified at 2 CFR Part 200. And such guidance applies to all federal grant and aid programs, including many that have been funded under the CARES Act. Emergency grant assistance must be both necessary and reasonable, according to the cited provisions on this slide. Those citations refer to uses having to clearly support the performance of that grant activity as a necessary expense. Also, the expense must be reasonable. And oftentimes, Clint and I recall when we would conduct these trainings in a meeting room, we would scratch our heads and say, well, what does reasonable actually mean? And we would say the same answer that actually appears in this portion of the Uniform Administrative Requirements, and that is reasonable is what would be the ordinary cost that a prudent person would incur under the given circumstances. So it is necessary for this emergency grant assistance to conform to those Uniform Administrative Requirement principles. Then finally, a grantee must document its policies and procedures for the amount of assistance they consider to be both necessary and reasonable. Before we leave emergency grant assistance, I want to address a few common issues that have become evident through frequently asked questions. Among a group of technical assistance providers, I serve on the AAQ desk and have seen questions raised very frequently around the topic of emergency grant assistance as a public services activity under CDBG. Consequently, I thought it would be useful for us to take a brief but deeper dive into the questions that have arisen around this most common use of CDBG-CV dollars for public services. Many of you may have actually asked questions around, first, may CDBG funds be used to pay arrearages? And the answer to that question is yes. In the annual CDBG program, funds may be used to pay rent and mortgage arrearages on behalf of individuals and families for up to 3 consecutive months. When using FY19 and FY20 funds to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus, or to CDBG-CV funds for the period of emergency payments has been extended from 3 consecutive months to 6 consecutive months per a notice appearing in the Federal Register a year and a half ago. Moreover, to use the extended period of 6 consecutive months for expenditures for FY19 and 20 funds, the use of funds requirement for prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus and the guidance of the period is applicable. So it's important to understand that just as with the annual formula grant program, the CV program does permit emergency grant assistance to pay for arrearages. A second very frequently asked question is, when does the emergency payments covered period actually begin? The answer to that question is, for each assisted individual or family, the 3-month period or the 6-month period, depending on the circumstances, begins on the date the first payment is made to a provider and on behalf of an individual or family. And then a third and final related question that seems to come up often is, does that covered period of either up to 3 or 6 consecutive months cover all arrearages or just those within the time frame? The start of the period is related to when payments are made from the grant, not the date of the arrearages. If an individual or family is 1 or more months in arrears, a grantee may cover some or all of the amount in arrears within the first month of assistance and continue through the applicable consecutive period of assistance. Here, an example is helpful. For an individual 4 months in arrears on rent who applied for emergency payment assistance under CDBG-CV, the covered period may include the 4 months they are in arrears within the payment for the first month of assistance, then continue for up to 5 more months to fulfill the up to 6 month consecutive month period of allowance. I hope that those examples and questions that are frequently raised around emergency grant assistance helped you understand how the eligible activity can be carried out in regard to public services. I would also urge you to take a look at the frequently asked questions list that is on the HUD Exchange website related to CDBG-CV, and you can always see an updated list of those frequently asked questions, which not surprisingly still does include those that I just went over with you. Next slide, please. Another eligible public service activity, particularly common during the pandemic, is food banks. CDBG funds may be provided to nonprofits or subrecipients like those that Clint earlier mentioned, as well as local public agencies to operate food banks that distribute food to individuals and families, and even cooperate with the delivery in home under the circumstances surrounding the pandemic. CDBG funds may be also used to purchase additional equipment such as refrigerators and freezers to store additional food and the food that will be distributed to those impacted by the pandemic. And then, consistent with what Clint went over earlier, costs associated with the operating and maintenance expenses of food distribution are eligible under this item listed within the CDBG regulations. Next slide, please. As indicated earlier, the CDBG-CV tieback requirement carries with it certain additional flexibilities. The Department of HUD did issue a guide in April of last year, which provides guidance to grantees that actually illustrates how a grantee is expected to tie back the delivery of public services to members of the community who have been impacted by the coronavirus. Examples range from job training to daycare to providing equipment, materials, and supplies. And as you see here, the focus on job training is necessarily directed to the neighborhoods affected by the coronavirus and the related job loss. Now, of course, over the course of the pandemic, the widespread effects of the pandemic are so extensive that practically any community that would otherwise be served by CDBG can satisfy the tieback requirement. The second example in the guide refers to increasing the capacity of, say, support services such as daycare and after-school services, where parents have maybe dropped out of the workforce and need to get back into the workforce, or providing equipment, supplies, and materials, as I mentioned before, but to carry out services not only related to the immediate effects of the pandemic, but to enable a recovery that bounces back and makes stronger the ability of a community to withstand any future events such as this health crisis or other kinds of major disasters that would impact the delivery of food and other support services, such as those related to healthcare, support for youth, communication through the internet, and then a safety net for those who are senior citizens. Next slide, please. As with the annual formula grant program, there are certain uses of CDBG funds that are not permitted. They are considered ineligible. One exception that is notable, covering the major use of public services grant money that I have referred to earlier, relates to those very emergency grant payments. It is possible, thanks to a specific exception specified in the law and the regulations, to permit emergency grant payments under the circumstances that I described earlier. But they cannot exceed the 3 months that I described earlier for CDBG, the additional period up to 6 months for CDBG-CV. And again, the payments must be made directly to the service provider. It is not possible as well to carry out an ongoing operation of what is referred to as a standalone public service. What I think is important to realize about public services is that the activities are service oriented to create a safety net. An example of an ineligible activity would be to qualify under public services the operation of rental housing. Housing would be considered a good that is not a service by itself. This would be different from paying for service that is within the housing development, such as counseling, but providing the safe, decent, sanitary dwelling unit and operating it for rent would be a standalone kind of public service that by itself would not be considered eligible. And then lastly, political activities, of course, are not considered eligible and therefore are prohibited in respect to public services and every other kind of CDBG grant assisted activity as well. Next slide, please. For the annual grant program, there is a public services gap. Annual obligations of funds for public services may not exceed 15% of the grant plus 15% of last year's program income. This is the limitation for entitlement communities. I want to note that the cap is expressed differently for states, and I would urge those who represent state grantees to look separately at the regulations pertaining to the administration of the state CDBG program. As you see here, there are exceptions that exist for certain services that are not covered by this cap. Examples include very old grants. I'm actually surprised that they're still even listed here. Assistance to micro enterprises, certain job training, specifically that's which is associated with an otherwise eligible economic development project and is kind of a supportive type of service that enables that economic development project to create or retain jobs. And then services carried out by a community-based development organization or other services occurring within an approved strategy area. Next slide. However, it's important to recognize that the CARES Act suspended the 15% public services cap for fiscal years 2019 and 2020 CDBG funds, as well as, of course, CDBG funds used for public services to address the coronavirus. As a consequence, grantees may conceivably use most or all of its CDBG-CV grant to provide public services which address the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic on its citizens. Now, before we begin the question and answer period, Clint and I would like to post a second poll to gain a better understanding of how grantees attending this session use CDBG-CV funds for public services. I'd now like to ask our CITEM team to please provide the support necessary to launch the second poll, which is a variation of the first with a focus on the uses of your CDBG-CV grants toward public services. Okay, the poll has been launched and we'll allow a little bit of time for the poll results to become evident, and Clint and I will then react to them. Meanwhile, if we might go to the next slide, we'll focus the remainder of our time on questions and answers. We have invited you to raise your questions by entering them in the Q&A function of Slido, and we have requested that you participate in an effort to help us prioritize the questions. Clint has acted as if he were on the battlefield trying to judge what patients, what soldiers to assist with immediate medical care. He's triaging the questions, and we will attempt to answer as many of the questions as we can in the time that will remain.
Okay, Randall, we've got, we'll start with some of the earlier questions here. We've got a good number to choose from. The first one states, we are a unit of local government and an entitlement community. Do we only need to be concerned with supplanting with sources of funds under the unit of local government's control, or should we be concerned with other sources as well? So I'm checking out 57201E, and it specifically says public service must be either a new service or quantifiable increase in the level of an existing service above that which has been provided, and here's the key part, provided by or on behalf of the unit of general local government through funds raised by the unit or received by the unit from the state in which it's located. So what we're talking about there in terms of an activity that has local, it's an activity that has local government funds that is in operation that then applies for CDBG funds. You can't replace those local government funds. So the answer to the question is, we're really concerned with, in this situation, we're concerned with actual local government funds that are under local government's control. Other sources such as private donations, foundations, income from thrift shops, those sorts of things, for this purpose, for that particular compliance purpose, you're not concerned about those. You're concerned about supplanting funds that are within your local government, your entitlement grantee's control.
And
Well,
Clint, just to add to your response, which I agree is the local government should only be concerned with those funds under its control. The Department of HUD also recognizes the pattern of funding that has existed for decades now, and that is a diminishing amount of funds. And consequently, the way that the second part of that phrase that Clint just cited is interpreted is much more favorable to local and state grantees. It's important to realize, as Clint noted at the very outset of this presentation, that the CDBG program came into existence in the 1970s. And the regulation that he just cited references a different era. Today, we see that there are quantifiable decreases in funding to practically every imaginable public service at the local or state level. And as such, the interpretation and the way that that standard is applied is a bit more accommodating. What I do think we will need to recognize is that the pandemic has added an unbelievable amount of additional funding, which will need to be taken into account. And it's probably important for jurisdictions to just document what is their basis for undertaking a new or a quantifiable increase in a level of service. I would urge them to tie it directly to what is evident from the needs analysis in both their action plan and their consolidated plan, to the extent that you have corollary records that support your choice to fund a public service activity, either under CDBG or under a CDBG-CV, will probably be accepted by your local HUD field office.
All right. Thank you for that background. We've got our second Q&A in. It is on a very related matter. The question is, can you provide where in the regs it is stated that if we continuously fund a public service organization with CDBG, that they do not need to increase services year to year? Also, does this apply only if the activity is awarded in consecutive years? This is a situation where when you read the regulation, you really need to read the regulation for what it's saying. And the training slides that we presented today, the HUD training slides, basically CDBG, elaborate on the regulations a bit more. They fill in the blank, and the blank is with the supplanting issue, CDBG funds are not for that purpose considered local funds. They're considered CDBG funds, and so for that reason they're not subject to this rule within 57201E on supplanting. So you could fund an organization with CDBG in 2019, fund them in 2020, fund them in 2021, skip 2022, fund them in 2023. So long as your CDBG funds aren't supplanting local funds, applying for CDBG one year, applying for CDBG a subsequent year, there's not a requirement that you increase quantifiably the output of that activity. That is specifically applying to situations where you might be supplanting local funds. So 57201E is your answer there.
It looks like our third question relates to emergency payment assistance, and it reads, if the provider, such as a landlord, will not accept payment directly, can the payment be provided to the applicant? And I believe the answer to that question is no. The regulations are very clear, and what I didn't explain in detail is the fact that income payments are expressly prohibited under the Housing and Community Development Act, and the regulations sought to and did provide a carve-out exception where emergency assistance could be made available on a short term, which, as I earlier explained, for CDBG has been up to 3 months. And for CDBG, the period extended up to 6 months. That exception is oriented particularly toward emergency payments where there is a strong interest on the part of HUD to avoid a situation where the department could be questioned about enabling payments to actually reach the beneficiary directly. If that were to occur, it would be in direct violation of what was not only expressly stated in the regulation, but also prohibited in the authorizing legislation, in the Housing and Community Development Act as amended. So that is what I would consider to be a hard and fast rule.
Clint, Randall, I'll add on a regulatory site for that. If you're looking for some additional backup, you're looking to 572. If you're an entitlement, you're looking to 57207B4, which is income payments, and it specifically indicates that the payments, whether you're following the CDBG rule of 3 months or the CDBG-CV flexibility for up to 6 months, must be made, quote, to the provider of such items or services on behalf of an individual or family. So that is a matter of regulation at 57207B4.
Clint, before we continue with the questions, which seem to now focus more on the second half of the presentation, perhaps we could check the poll results and react to them to
Absolutely.
Break up our answers to questions. And at the
slide, let's take a look.
Okay, based upon the question, what public service activities does your community currently fund with CDBG or CDBG-CV to prevent, prepare for, or respond to COVID-19? It appears that services to the homeless has the largest number of responses, 36%, as opposed to 31% for emergency rental assistance, 21% for emergency mortgage assistance. If we were to combine those two, if you could scroll back down to the emergency rental assistance, I just want to note that we did bifurcate the types of emergency rental assistance, and what has been apparent through at least the nearly 2+ years of this pandemic is that the emergency grant assistance has been the most common use of CDBG, CV, or the FY19 or 20 CDBG-CV grant dollars that are used to respond to the pandemic. It's interesting, I think, to note, however, that the services for homeless persons has jumped up, even I think greater than the number that we saw in your poll, Clint, which was a little was also in the 30 range, but not almost to 40%, which is pretty striking. Do you have any observations about the poll results?
I would always be interested to see where we landed on poll 1. Because I know we left that open for a little bit longer and received some additional responses. So we, for poll 2, we had homeless, and poll 1, it looks like we're still, who's the leader here? Services for seniors. Some clear distinctions here.
That's a change. Interesting.
Homeless is still right up there, 40 to 44. So,
and historically, I think that if we were to look at IDAS reports, as has occurred with regard to the CV grants, which incidentally do indicate that public services, of course, is the activity that has attracted the most funding, and particularly emergency payment assistance. But historically, the main annual formula grant CDBG program has oftentimes been used mainly to assist public services for seniors. So this doesn't really surprise me. And then, of course, the homeless, we have not yet seen, the results of the point in time counts that occurred in the last couple of weeks, but chances are across the nation, as the Secretary of HUD's noted, we'll see a significant spike in homelessness in communities from the pandemic's impacts.
All right, I think I'm going to take another question here and do another. This one's from earlier in the session. It reads, in regards to food delivery services such as Meals on Wheels, what is the best way to evaluate or document eligibility for service providers outside of our jurisdiction? The grantee writes that their local Meals on Wheels is geographically located in the next town over, but the Meals on Wheels programs primarily serves that grantee's residents. So if you're looking for some regulatory backup to justify using a provider who may be based out of another jurisdiction, maybe a nearby jurisdiction, but that is providing services to your residents, you'd want to look at 24 CFR 570-309, which deals with the restriction on the location of activities. So effectively, the rule is CDBG funds can assist an activity that's located outside the jurisdiction of the grantee if the grantee determines that the activity is necessary to further the purposes of the act and the recipient's community development objectives. And here's the key part. You need to determine that that activity reasonably benefits your residents. So reasonable benefits are accruing to your jurisdiction's residents. Easy way to do that is at intake for that program that may be located outside of your jurisdiction. Have that intake include the participants or the beneficiaries supplying their address so that they're identifying as residents of your jurisdiction that are availing themselves to that service provider. That way you'll know that your CDBG funds are going to serve your residents and that you're complying with the regulation and getting what HUD terms a reasonable accrued benefit to the jurisdiction of the grantee. And the reg goes on to say that, of course, document the basis for such determination prior to providing CDBG funds for the activity. So obviously that's an arrangement that you're aware of when they apply to your jurisdiction for funds, when they're seeking CDBG funds. And so when you're evaluating the eligibility of the activity, how it's going to work, where people are going to receive service, how many of your residents are receiving service versus residents of other communities that may be within that provider's service area. Those are all considerations you'd want to document in your file. Some jurisdictions will prepare an eligibility review memo to show that they've evaluated the service and kind of understand the inner workings and that your residents will benefit.
Clint, we also have a tricky question related to arrearages again, and it asks, can CV dollars be used for utility arrearages? And the person who poses that question says, I understand rent and mortgage arrearages can be covered, and that is true. There are special interpretations that have been offered through the AAQ desk in regard to arrearages, as I mentioned, that has been a very difficult element of interpreting what would be considered housing expenses. Utilities are included, and I believe that as such, rent and mortgage arrearages are covered. I believe utility arrearages are covered as well. What I would urge the person who's asked this question to do is to check with a recent posting on the HUD exchange that concerns utilities. There is actually a fairly new guidance that came out within the last 6 months, which addresses utilities, including public utilities. And so I would check that particular aspect of this as well. It depends in part on whether the utility is provided by a private company or a public utility that is owned and operated by the grantee. And in each instance, it is necessary to only pay. This is where the uniform administrative requirements come into play. Remember, I said that the payment must be necessary and reasonable. And it's necessary for a grantee to arrive at a cost for a utility that is both necessary and reasonable. And where utilities have marked up, frankly, the cost if they're a for-profit, it is necessary to adjust that cost with the cooperation of the utility company to reflect what would be considered a necessary and reasonable cost. And I would expect that applies to the arrearage as well. Clint, do you have any thoughts on that tricky question?
No, I think you covered it very well, and always best to consult the guidance and the FAQs. And if you need to get into discussion with more detail about your specific activity and the specific situation, we always encourage you to reach out to your CPD representative in the local field office. It's better to get those types of things resolved and cleared up front than to wait until the back end of monitoring. And they're available to help. The HUD Exchange AAQ help desk for CDBG-CV is very much open and very active. So that's also a good place to go into a lot more detail in your questions and get a fully formed written response with citations and links to guidance and so forth. So definitely encourage all of our participants to avail themselves of those resources, and someone like Randall or myself will be considering your question and sending an answer on. Got another question on public services. This was a fun one, especially in the dead of winter. It is summer camp. Can CDBG funds be used for the cost of transporting a child to and from summer camp? This child would also be granted a scholarship to attend the summer camp. So we're talking about eligible costs for CDBG public service activities. And as I mentioned during the presentation, labor, supplies, materials, maintenance, operations. It's a pretty wide variety of costs that can be paid with CDBG funds under public service. What it really comes down to in this situation is how you define the public service. Does your activity include, as the public service as defined, is it providing a scholarship to attend the summer camp and providing transportation to and from the summer camp? And I'm imagining, perhaps it's a child from a low and moderate income family. Perhaps there are transportation issues, and to make sure that that child has the full benefit of the activity, the public service would be defined as including transportation and the summer camp. If that's something that you're making available as part of the service, it is directly related to the public service, I could see that being eligible. And of course, different ways to handle transportation. And so, you'd want to make sure that you're also considering the cost principles into CFR 200. If you're, contracting out for transportation services, perhaps from a neighborhood park to the location where the summer camp's being operated, You'll want to make sure you're procuring for that appropriately and documenting that those costs are reasonable and necessary. But it really does have a lot to do with how you define the activity and what benefits you're making available to the beneficiaries in your program.
The next question we have relates to CDBG-CV, Clint, and it asks, can CDBG-CV be used for rehab of a food bank? And I'll answer this question in two ways. The first is to note that where there is a rehabilitation or construction of a public facility, the activity is typically better qualified under a different category than public services. Public services, as the name implies, is about the delivery of services. If the delivery of the services, kind of going back to Clint's remarks about the summer camp, is described as an activity, an event over the summer that requires transportation equipment, then it's possible to provide that equipment. Likewise, I gave examples of food banks that have added refrigerators and storage facilities to cover expanded use of their food bank and to distribute more food. If the rehabilitation involved replacement or extending a wing with added capacity to respond to the pandemic, and there is that tie back, I believe the activity could qualify depending upon how significant the rehabilitation is. I mean, if it's more than just expanding the space for additional equipment, like the examples that I used to enable full scale distribution of food, it becomes less of a public service and more of a public facility. So I would urge the grantee to, again, confer with your local HUD office about the best course of action there. And of course, not forget, when using the CV funds, that the tieback is necessary. Plus, there is the added provision that whatever would be undertaken by the grantee must also satisfy the uniform administrative requirements that Clint and I keep coming back to with regard to procurement and the cost principles. Necessary and appropriate expenses only are allowed.
All right. Still getting a few questions in here, so thanks everyone for that. Another question in, can CDBG funds be used to pay or to purchase, rather, equipment needed to provide a public service? For example, webcams or laptops for public service staff to provide remote counseling, attend court remotely, etc. So it sounds like perhaps we've got a program that is advocating for emancipated youth, CASA type program. Really great public services out there. So thank you for funding those types of activities. And the answer is yes, of course. Equipment, supplies, materials. So that's kind of in your supplies and materials component. If we were looking at the slide, it says labor, supplies, materials. Equipment, yes. There's some nuance here when we talk about equipment. You and I would definitely consider, laptops, webcams, and those types of computing devices to be, equipment that we use to do our jobs. But important also to check in on 2 CFR 200 and make sure that you are appropriately defining that in your file as you're evaluating the eligibility of the request. And the reason I say that is there are additional documentation steps that you need to follow for things that are considered equipment, generally having a value of more than $5,000. So if your computing device happened to be available, I mean, some of these devices, the one I'm using right now, I think was has gone down to $799. That's not what I paid years ago for it, but that's neither here nor there. So be careful with that. I think from a a uniform admin requirement standpoint, some of the things that you're talking about would be considered supplies and would totally be eligible. Equipment also would be eligible, but just be aware of that additional documentation requirement. And also always make sure that you are documenting, particularly with things like this that could become question marks. I mean, you're asking the question here. A HUD CPD representative may ask the question during monitoring. Your single auditor may ask the question. So it's important that, you know, as you're documenting that purchase, as you're documenting that those types of items are eligible under your subrecipient agreement or your written agreement for the public service activity, be sure to indicate and elaborate in your description how those devices will be used, who's using them, who's purchasing them, whose custody are they in, so that it's clear that those, you know, webcams and laptops are dedicated to the public service activity, and it's not, you know, hey, I'm gonna provide a public service activity for a couple hours a week, but the rest of the time, you know, this is Clint or Randall's laptop that they're consulting with. So just make sure that you're tying that together.
Yeah, and to that point, Clint, I think one expectation that would be implied by the uniform administrative requirements is that you document that the supplies or the equipment are necessary, that is, they're assisting in the performance of that activity and the participants who are benefiting from it in a manner where you have, as Clint indicated, you document that those items are associated with that public service. And that would probably mean, from the standpoint of the fact that they are movable objects, they're not fixed assets attached to the building where the activity is carried out. They would need to be tagged and listed as in the inventory and controlled as property that is associated with the sponsor of that eligible public service activity. And you would want to essentially prevent any harder to answer questions from HUD or your auditor about, you know, where are those computers, where are the other pieces of equipment and supplies that were supposed to be necessary to carry out the support services that were planned.
So Randall, I think we need to tackle this one. It's an existential question for this session. It's a very straightforward question, and I suspect that it may have been asked before you covered the CDBG-CV waiver of the public service cap. But the question is, why is there a public service cap in CDBG? Some staff members and city council members would call that the $1 million question, or maybe it's the $10,000 question. But nonetheless, you know, from my recollection, it's a statutory matter.
It is, and I actually came across, in preparation for the second half of our presentation, one explanation that seemed to resonate with what I recall through the history of the CDBG program. The FAQs that I referenced, and you remember that I read carefully from the answers to certain questions and their answers around arrearages. On that list of FAQs is a question that kind of goes to the heart of what you're asking here. Why is there a public services cap? More specifically, in this context, why was there and is there the 3-month limitation on emergency rental payments? And the text that I read noted that providing such emergency payment assistance or delivering public services in general can be extremely expensive for a jurisdiction. And the framers of the housing and community development programs that cover CDBG and home and the other programs recognize that the needs are so significant, they wanted to provide guidance that enables grantees to have at least limits that keep their program completely responsive to the wide range of community needs identified in the consolidated plan and the annual action plans. And so it's partly a limitation that just recognizes the reality that there are significant housing needs, significant public infrastructure needs, significant job creation needs in every community. And if there were, but for a pandemic, an unlimited cap or no limit on the expenditure for public services in the annual program, it very quickly could become a program that isn't achieving community development, but is more designed primarily for the delivery of public services. We also have a question here that kind of looks at the target groups for these different programs. Would income assistance to LMI persons with CDBG funds be eligible? And if yes, how could a program such as income assistance be implemented? And the answer is it would not be eligible. In fact, what I do want to stress is among the slides that you will receive is one that refers to ineligible activities. And one of the ineligible activities expressly listed, again, is income payments. And I mentioned earlier that that's actually called out in the law, and then Clint specifically referenced the fact that it's expressed again in the regulations, and he gave us the citation. So income payments are ineligible. General, what the phrase is family sustenance payments, which were at the time the law was passed, there was a federal program, supplemental income assistance. And at the time, the Congress said, we don't want CDBG to be used for that kind of income support. So the answer is no, it's not eligible. And there's no way for such general income assistance to be implemented. The exception that we have been able to use to a greater extent for emergency rent payment assistance and mortgage payment assistance is as far as I think we could expect HUD and the Congress to ever go with the CDBG program.
Okay, we've got another question coming in. It's a Meals on Wheels question. I love that program. For Meals on Wheels activities, the activity serves, in this jurisdiction, it serves both seniors and those with disabilities. How would this qualify under a national objective? I'm going to invite you all to tune in to tomorrow's presentation on CDBG national objectives, shameless plug, for day 2 of basically CDBG-CV here at the 2022 HUD CARES Act conference, virtual conference. But actually, since you asked it here, we'll go ahead and answer it here. It's pretty straightforward, and I think you're on the right track. You're considering presumed benefit 570-208 A2I. It's the A group, the presumed groups. But here's the catch. Right. Here's the catch. So the question says both seniors and those with disabilities. In both of those words are in the definition of a presumed group. However, disabilities has a caveat. And in order for someone to be considered a member of a presumed group that has disabilities, that individual needs to be what is termed a severely disabled adult. And so that is someone meeting the Bureau of the Census definition of severely disabled adult. So if it were a child with a severe disability, they would not qualify under the presumption. So if seniors and severely disabled adults together, and that's the cohort that you're serving with the CDBG public service funds. Presumed group would be a great place to look. Now, if that's not a choice that you're willing to make in terms of limiting the activity to just those two groups, seniors and or elderly persons and severely disabled adults, I should say, then you'd have a situation where there are other beneficiaries that would need to be income qualified. And you can't mix in a CDBG activity presumed group and income qualification. So we'll cover that a bit more during national objectives tomorrow. In order for presumed groups to work, the entire activity, all of the people served need to be members of one or more of the listed presumed groups at 57208. So it's a good question. I think you're on the right track, but just take it all the way to the conclusion and look at it real carefully.
Clint, we also have a question related to job training, and it asks us, if a grantee never funded job training services before and wants to, is it permitted to just enter into a subrecipient agreement with one or more nonprofits? Or is an RFQ required to invite any nonprofits or for-profit job training service providers to submit a proposal? The short answer to this question is yes, the jurisdiction can just enter into a subrecipient agreement. Subrecipients are designated, they're not procured. However, a best practice among most jurisdictions nationwide would be to request proposals and consider the proposals against each other. Why? That helps the jurisdiction not only inject a degree of competition, but also more easily satisfy what we keep referencing as the uniform administrative requirements, in order to establish that the cost for that job training service, either by the nonprofit group that might have been might enter into an agreement, or a for-profit company, is reasonable, it would be helpful to have more than just one proposal with which the jurisdiction enters into a subrecipient agreement. So you have discretion, but here again, we would urge you to follow the best practice. And I think it's also probably important for you to recognize whatever has been the past pattern for identifying new and different services. If this is in fact based upon your consolidated plan's description of a major change, it might trigger a substantial amendment to your consolidated plan, where you would first want to go through the routine of amending your plan. And when undertaking such a public process, there is often an expectation that such a major change would be followed up with a routine that might include, in your jurisdiction, a customary request for proposals, which you would be expected to do, even though you might not be required to do so according to the regulations.
All right, we've got an additional question. So got a good stream of questions here that we can get to. Question is, how would we best document eligibility if providing funds to a subrecipient, a food bank, who will be delivering fresh produce and milk to families? Will applications need to be taken from the beneficiaries to determine eligibility? Yet again, another shameless plug for tomorrow's national objectives session, but we'll go ahead and take it here. And as we'll explain in the national objectives session, eligibility is one thing, and we've spent a lot of time today talking about one specific eligible activity within the broader CDBG program, and that's CDBG public services. But the other side of that is national objectives, and you need both sides of that coin, so to speak, to to have an actual eligible activity. It needs to be eligible, and it also needs to meet a national objective. And your question is really squarely getting at what are your possible national objectives for a public service activity that's a food bank? It really depends on the nature of your community. I would first look at it from a low mod area perspective. If the food bank is serving all of the residents of an area that's primarily residential and is at least 51% low and moderate income, and that area is the entire area served by the activity, then you might be in business under area basis, and you wouldn't necessarily need to take a full application from beneficiaries. You just need to verify their residency in the service area. On the flip side, what often happens is food banks in many communities tend to be regional. They may serve people from across jurisdictional lines outside of your grantee jurisdiction, or it might not qualify as area benefit. And in those situations, you're looking at those low and moderate income limited clientele national objective categories. Is it presumed group? Probably not that narrow, probably not that limited. So in any event, you're probably looking at, if I had to guess from what you provided in the question, you're probably looking really hard at an application and intake process for those beneficiaries to evaluate the income of their families against the income limits for your jurisdiction, the 80% of AMI low and moderate income limits published on the HUD website. So we'll get into some of that a bit in tomorrow's session, but I like that you're already thinking ahead to the full breadth of documentation that's going to be necessary, both at the grantee level and at the subrecipient level. All really important considerations to make sure that you're able to invest your funds in the community.
So the parting message is tune in tomorrow.
All right. Okay, so we've got another question here. If a food bank receives CDBG funding, what requirements are there for income eligibility documentation of the people that use the food bank, or must this be funded on an LMA basis only? So requirements for income eligibility documentation, you're looking at, who is the individual that's coming into the food bank, who is their family, what is that family's income, depending on the nature of the income, what supporting documentation is reasonable and appropriate to substantiate the annual gross amount of their income, and are they in fact under the limits. In that situation, you are also considering collection of demographic information. As you understand in IDIS, you're required to report on the ethnicity and the race, the income level of each of the people that are served in a public service activity. That's your performance indicator, is people, unduplicated people. So in that situation, if you're going with low and moderate income limited clientele, you're looking at, you're definitely looking at some income eligibility documentation and maintaining that with an intake form.
For the food bank to only qualify the distribution of food without the income determination, service area would have to be confined to the low and moderate income area, and you would have to provide documentation that would evidence in your policies and procedures that the food is only distributed within that LMA area. So this is an example where the course of determining what part of the national objective for benefiting low and moderate income persons applies largely depends on the design of the food bank. And here again, I want to refer you to the CDBG-CV frequently asked questions. When I was looking at that long list and selected just 3 questions to share with you, my recollection is there was also a question just like what you raised about the appropriate type of documentation. And Clint gave you the example of what would be appropriate where the food bank is serving a large geographic area that includes LMA areas and those that are not LMA areas, in which case the limited clientele approach would become necessary. But for the example that I just shared with you, you would have a simpler and more straightforward course of establishing the necessary documentation. So I urge you to look at the FAQs and again, confer with your local HUD field office. They know what your jurisdiction is like and what would make sense. And of course, there will be far more detailed examples provided tomorrow in the session in regarding to documenting compliance for national objectives.
All right, another question along the national objectives line. We're rolling here, Randall. Can you mix two presumed groups? It's a follow-up on the Meals on Wheels question. So the short answer is yes. You can mix 2 presumed groups: seniors, severely disabled adults, migrant farm workers. You could mix 4 or 5 of them so long as the activity exclusively serves one or more of the listed groups in the reg. So good question. Another question coming in here. Can we use CDBG CARES money to pay the property tax portion of a mortgage payment? And I'm going to defer to Randall on this one.
And I believe the answer to that question is yes, provided that that's just the regular property tax. There is some past practice and interpretation of HUD guidance that says that penalties and fines may fall into a different category there. But here again, it would be important to have all of the information in regard to the answer to this question. And what we would urge you to do is, here again, check with your local HUD office, because they probably would know how property taxes are paid. And with a mortgage, usually, you know, it is escrowed, and you're right, it's a portion of the mortgage payment.
Yeah, I believe I saw an FAQ. I was trying to pull that up quickly, but Google is not being friendly with HUD Exchange today, so I apologize. But I do recall seeing a Q&A on that, and if the property taxes were escrowed as part of the monthly mortgage payment, that was allowable. So definitely check out the FAQ for more details on that at HUD Exchange on the CDBG-CV page.
Clint, we have a consolidated plan question. This might be a little different. The grantee posing the question writes, our consolidated plan GOI included public services activities other than low mod income housing benefit. With CV, we supported overnight homeless shelters, a different GOI. Do we need to amend the consolidated plan and corresponding action plan to include homeless person overnight shelter GOI?
Okay, so following that, in your consolidated plan, you had a goal for public service activities other than low mod income housing benefit, which is fine. So that's going to be people as your unit of measurement. With CV, you provided overnight homeless shelters. Do you need to amend the con plan and corresponding action plan to include homeless person overnight shelter? Nuanced answer.
It is.
You need to, I think, first and foremost, when we're thinking about amending the consolidated plan, there's a point of departure here. Is the amendment something that is small enough for you to just go in and into IDIS, make the edit, perhaps update the document that's on your website or that's made available to the public and be done. Minor administrative matter to correctly report accomplishments and have it tie out to your caper? Or is that change in direction in terms of the goal substantial enough that your citizen participation plan adopted under Part 91 would require a change in goals under a strategic plan goal to rise to the level of a substantial amendment? And so this is definitely a matter that I would want to advise you on more locally in consideration of what your citizen participation plan says about how substantial amendments to consolidated plans are defined. It's a locally defined criteria. It sounds like you're talking about kind of inside baseball with goal outcome indicators. I'm fairly certain from your question, it sounds like you've probably got data either way this goes, but you want to make sure that you're reporting the most appropriate indicator. So there's some considerations for you. I don't know, Randall, do you have some additional thoughts?
Well, I agree with your assessment. And I think the first place I would look would be your consolidated plans language around the threshold for what's referred to as a substantial amendment. And if your local HUD office followed the guidance at Part 92, the instruction calls on your jurisdiction to define what is a substantial amendment. And sometimes the language isn't very specific, but you are expected to follow your policies and procedures, which is to consistently apply whatever the language is and think about your past practice. So I would look at how the threshold is defined and judge whether you would be following the guidance in that plan to treat it as something less than a substantial amendment or not. And if you are in doubt, here again, I would urge you to confer with your local HUD office, because if they do see what would be considered a new and different activity, the con plan regulations do use that phrase, and they could easily judge that it were a change that required a substantial amendment, and that would be worse than you not having conferred with them at all, in which case you're going to have to cover your tracks. So I agree with Clint, and I would add in the piece of if there's any doubt, check with your local HUD office, because they're the ones who would question you on whether you followed your own plan and policy and procedures.
All right, I think we've got a couple of quick ones here. Can mileage be reimbursed for agency staff to travel to assist the client in a public service activity? If that is the design and how the public service activity is defined, that a member of the implementing agency or implementing subrecipient staff would go to that beneficiary, then yes, mileage could be among the eligible costs in your written agreement. Of course, you'd want to document that appropriately in accordance with the uniform admin requirements. So again, to CFR 200, you're looking at mileage logs and making sure that the reimbursement is at a reasonable rate, which typically is the published IRS mileage rate that is effective at that time. So that doesn't sound like an issue. It sounds like it's attainable, provided you have good records and mileage logs to support that reimbursement. And of course, print out a copy of the IRS rate from the irs.gov website to go in your file to substantiate that reimbursement, so that a year or two later, when an auditor is looking at your files, they don't have to go digging for the rate. It's a surefire way to keep your single auditor or your HUD CPD representative very happy. So
I think we have a follow-up question on the food bank, question raised earlier about the national objective compliance. It reads, to follow up on the food bank delivery of milk and fresh produce question, the areas delivered to will be all low mod areas. can we then treat this as an area benefit and just document the names and addresses of the beneficiaries of the food? And I would say the answer generally is yes. I would not stop at just names and addresses, but what's important is that the description of the food bank program identify that geographical area served, and you include a map or some other range of addresses that would then correspond with your intake lists of names and addresses of the beneficiaries, so you can cross-reference and demonstrate in your files that only those who benefited are residents of the LMA area, and as such satisfied with the national objective on an area benefit basis.
All right, we have another question coming in here. If a homeless shelter is being rehabbed, would a refrigerator, dishwasher, stove, or other appliances be eligible to be purchased with CDBG or CDBG-CV funds? Under public service, supplies and equipment are eligible if they're necessary to deliver the public service. Under a public facilities and improvement activity, so the more substantial rehabilitation that Randall had alluded to earlier, where it's outside the public service cap, it's in a different part of the regulations. It's at 57201C instead of public service, which is 57201E and is capped at the 15%. There's some different considerations. So if the activity is a public service, those types of equipment are necessary to deliver the service and could be purchased. If you're looking at a capital improvement project or a public facilities improvement project, to use the regulatory terminology, these types of equipment that are not an integral structural fixture would not be eligible. So the refrigerator, you can move that off to a different site very easily, the dishwasher, the stove, etc.
I'll just add, Clint, one observation here. A lot of the questions we've heard are being asked in the context of a session on public services. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that there are questions that relate to other eligible activities. But what we will all face as grantees and those who are providing technical assistance and consulting services to cities, counties, and states is a new reality. The perhaps new normal won't be that different from the normal prior to the pandemic, where there is a 15% cap on public services. So as you are designing your programs, you want to thoughtfully consider other eligible activities. The CDBG program provides a lot of discretion in that respect. And where you don't want to bump up against a cap that does eventually present a controlling limit again and causes you perhaps not to be able to undertake certain activities, you want to thoughtfully and intentionally qualify the activities where it makes most sense. And there is the category of public facility improvements that Clint mentioned, and there are others as well. Including what I think we're about to drift off to here in one of the last questions, it looks like. For small business assistance, could CDBG-CV funds be able to pay for business owners' evidence/certificate of insurance, such as flood miscellaneous insurance? And the answer to that question is generally yes, depending on how that economic development program is designed. If it is a small business assistance program that includes operating capital, that could be considered among the types of expenses that would be covered for the general operation, because it is CV funds. Again, it would be necessary to tie back that expense to the pandemic. And one thing that we have not mentioned yet in this session is that there would be a necessarily an analysis of any potential duplication of benefits. Where we're talking about assisting a small business, we know that there were and still are other federal and state programs that have assisted small businesses and will continue to do so through the economic recovery from the pandemic. So it'll be important for any sponsor or any jurisdiction that undertakes such a small business assistance program, particularly for operating capital, to carefully describe the program design and ensure that it analyzes requests for assistance and documents that the assistance isn't duplicated by another source at that particular time when the jurisdiction or the business in the jurisdiction, in this case, wants to renew, say, their certificate of insurance for flood or miscellaneous purposes. Did we actually reach the end of our list, Clint?
We are very close. I think you just answered 2 or 3 of them, and we're down. Yeah, no, you're covering a lot of ground. I think these are all great questions. I want to thank everyone that has tuned in and participated with us live today at the 2022 HUD CARES Act virtual conference. One last question here: if using CDBG-CV funds to pay for outreach services to homeless persons, would materials such as PPE, tents, hand sanitizer, etc., be allowed? If the tents are given to homeless individuals, would they still need to be part of an inventory and tracked? You would want to document that you had provided all of these materials to homeless individuals, but in terms of being part of a formal tagged inventory, only those items where the cost was $5,000 or more under 2 CFR 200 would need to actually be tagged into an inventory. You would want to maintain documentation of, hey, I engaged with individual, XYZ on this date at this location and provided all of these, the PPE, the sanitizer, the tent, etc., so that they could remain healthy and safe. But you don't have to do a formal inventory unless these are very elaborate and expensive tents that you're providing that cost more than $5,000 a unit. So hopefully that information is useful to you all. On behalf of Randall and myself and the entire team with the CARES Act conference, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today. I'm going to turn this back over to our team at CITEM to let you know what's coming up next on the program. Thank you all.